Hello and welcome to this series of videos dedicated to Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto. This is the first video where we're going to start talking about the plot. In this video I'm only going to talk about the first canto because the number of references that Ariosto included in the first canto to the previous work called Orlando Innamorato is very high. Also, since we are just getting started, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to talk about the poem's goals, the poem's literary origins, and finally the language, the Italian that Ariosto used. Number 1. Goals. Let's start with the beginning or incipit of the poem. Le donne, i cavalier, l'arme, gli amori, le cortesie, le audaci imprese io canto. And let's try to compare this with another famous incipit, the incipit of the Divine Comedy by Dante. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. These two beginnings already tell us the huge difference between these poems. They are almost incomparable to each other. The first one, Dante, the older one, 200 years earlier, is a poem that starts from a deep human crisis, and it promises to dig as deeply as possible into the human heart. The second one, Ariosto's poem, doesn't promise any of that. In fact, Ariosto is going to sing about women, he's going to sing about knights, he's going to sing about adventures, and you're almost starting to have fun already just reading the first two lines. So I'm going to read the first two lines of Barbara Reynolds' introduction because I think she really nails it. The Orlando Furioso is above all a poem to be enjoyed. The chief aim of its creator was to give delight. Number 2, the literary origins. While it's easy to think back of Dante's Divine Comedy as an encyclopedia of the time that really sourced from anywhere and everywhere that Dante could find, when it comes to Ariosto, his main influences are three: the Carolingian cycle, the Celtic cycle or Arthurian cycle, and all the classics that he had been reading deeply as the literary person that he was. So Ariosto writes 400 years after the Chanson de Roland. And let's remember that Roland or Orlando was in fact a living, breathing historic figure. He fought for Charlemagne, and he's also mentioned in the Divine Comedy. Roland is first mentioned in Inferno by Dante, when the entrance of Dante and Virgil into the circle of traitors is heralded by a blast upon a horn, blown by the giant Nimrod. But then in Paradiso, in the heaven of Mars, Dante comes into the presence of the defenders of the faith. This heaven, that's the symbol of fortitude. In this heaven, Dante meets Cacciaguida, who was his ancestor, great-great-great-grandpa. And it is Cacciaguida who calls out the names of 8 warriors who flash like rubies across the glittering bands of pure white light which form the image of the cross. And here Roland is mentioned and he is seen as his soul, the soul of Roland, is placed in Paradiso by Dante. So in reading Orlando Furioso, we have to remember that not only Roland and Orlando, but an entire cast of characters already existed, pre-existed to the life of Ariosto, Ludovico Ariosto, and he breathes new life into them, of course, in a completely new and exciting adventure. But most of these characters had already, either in history or in legend, existed before his own work. And finally, 3, the language. What kind of language choices did Ariosto make? Very interestingly, Ariosto chose to write in the ottava rima, which is the same meter that had been chosen by Baiardo in writing the Orlando Innamorato. And it's really the same meter of most of the most important Italian epic poems, including Torquato Tasso, Gerusalemme Liberata. So it was a fashionable meter. It's a meter that lends itself very well to the sound of Italian language. And the ottava rima, historically, had been used for the very first time in literature by Boccaccio. And what it consists of is very simply a series of stanzas, all of 8 lines of 11 syllables each. And each stanza is composed of 3 alternate rhymes and one final couple of rhymes that in Italian are called rima baciata, which literally means kissed rhyme, which is a double rhyme. So A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. This is the ottava rima, and it perfectly conveys all the energy, the movement, and all the punchlines that this incredible story has. So let's get started. I studied the Orlando Furioso when I was at school. I didn't have the chance to read it, the entire work back at school, so for me it's a partial reread. But when I reread the first canto a few days ago, I was literally laughing out loud, and that doesn't happen very often with me. I was either smiling or laughing out loud. The type of joyful energy that was coming to me, transmitted to me from the book was incredible. One of the techniques that Ariosto uses, and that's been repeated over and over when analyzing the Orlando Furioso, is with a French word. It's called Entrelacement, which means basically interlacing of different plots and different narrative lines. Almost it makes me think of when you're lacing your shoes, or even better, it makes me think of the video game Tetris. I'll make an example. Try to see, when you're reading Canto 1 of Orlando Furioso, try to see the scenes where the character Rinaldo is present on the scene, and you will understand how good Ariosto is in making him enter the stage, exit the stage, enter the stage, exit, in all this vortex, tornado of movement that it is. To be clear, Rinaldo appears at stanza number 11, and he disappears at the end of stanza 12. Then he appears again at stanza 17 and disappears again at the end of stanza 23. Then we see him very, very quickly between stanzas 31 and 32. Then he disappears again to finally reappear again towards the end of the first canto at between stanza 77 and 81. So this is an example, only an example, but everything is masterfully crafted by Ariosto. So Bradamante was the king of Africa, and this is a name that came from a historic king of Andalusia and probably some other territories, who was a Muslim king, and his actual name was Abd er-Rahman. You can see how Italianized this Abd er-Rahman can become Bradamante, and that's the origin of this character. He wanted to avenge the death of Troiano, and Troiano was his father, killed by Orlando. In the second stanza we have an interesting couple of lines that need to be interpreted. Ariosto says: "Se da colei che tal quasi m'ha fatto, che il poco ingegno ador mi lima, me ne sarà però tanto concesso, che mi basti a finir quanto ho promesso." We have to know that who this woman is that he is talking about. Who is this she that he's referring to without any specification? This she is Alessandra Benucci. Alessandra Benucci was the real woman that Ariosto, toward the end of his life, married and whom he loved. He's not dedicating the song to her, but he's saying, I'm almost made as mad in my mind by the love that I have for this woman, and I'm hoping that she will actually give me the mental space sufficient to write this glorious epic poem. In the third and fourth stanzas, Ariosto speaks directly to Ippolito d'Este, who was his sponsor, whom he worked for, and whom he dedicated the poem to. So he calls him Herculean Prole, or Herculia Prole in Italian, son of Hercules, because Ercole I, Hercules the first of Este, was the father of Ippolito. And he also mentions at the beginning of the fourth stanza Ruggiero, or that Ruggiero, who is one of the two main progenitors of the family of Este in the legend, part of the encomiastic scope of or goal of the Orlando Furioso is to celebrate the highly noble origins of the family of the Este. In fact, this Ruggiero, in the legend, was supposed to be a descendant of even Hector from Troy. That's how high his lineage was. In the 5th stanza, we learn that Orlando has been in love with the beautiful Angelica for a long time, and for her he traveled all around the world, especially in the East, Far East, Middle East, etc. And now he's brought her back to France. Now, as soon as she has arrived, everybody sees how beautiful she is, and Orlando's cousin Rinaldo sees her and he also falls in love with her. So there is a duel. Orlando and Rinaldo are preparing to fight with each other for Angelica. Charlemagne, who is the king that these two guys are fighting, are supposed to fight for, but they are distracted by their love, realizes that this is not going to be useful to anybody, especially to him. And so he comes up with a stratagem, let's say. He says, I'm going to secure Angelica, your trophy, and I'm going to ask one of my trusted advisors so that he can keep her safe, while you guys actually fight for me, do your job, the job that you are supposed to be doing. And in the end, I'm going to award Angelica to the one of you who's been the best fighter, who killed more Saracens and who distinguished himself the most on the battlefield. Unfortunately, though, things do not pan out like everybody wanted them to, because in the middle of stanza 9, we hear the following. Contrari ai voti poi furo I successi. The success was against what they were hoping for, what they were praying for. Chi in fuga andò la gente battezzata e con molti altri fu il duca prigione e restò abbandonato il padiglione. This is the opportunity for Angelica to run away. So Angelica runs away on a horse. She rides the horse into a woods, and in this woods she meets with Rinaldo, who in the meantime, he had lost his great horse called Baiardo. We need to remember because we'll see him later. And he's just running by himself in a very comedic scene. In fact, Ariosto says, "E più legger correa per la foresta, ch'al pallio rosso il villan mezzo ignudo." He's referring here to kind of a game or a sport that even Dante referred to in the Divine Comedy in Inferno 15, because the pallio was a piece of cloth, almost like a long cloak, that was given to whoever won a race. And in Inferno 15, Dante mentions this pallio. Rinaldo loves Angelica. Angelica hates Rinaldo. So she turns around very quickly and runs away as quickly as she can, while he starts chasing her. This whole story is a story of running, chasing. I think almost the entire poem, epic poem, is about running and chasing. Angelica arrives at a riverbank where she sees yet another knight. This is Ferrau. Ferrau was an already existing character in these legends. He was a giant, in fact, who was fighting with the Saracens, and he was a Saracen himself. In Orlando Innamorato, Ferrau, or Ferraguto, he had a slightly different name, Ferraguto, also had fallen in love with Angelica, and in the Constitution he ended up killing Angelica's brother, whose name is Argalia. And just before Argalia died, he asked Ferrau to promise him that he would also bury all his armor and his weapons with him. Ferrau had asked if he could keep the helmet with him for a little bit longer, but then he promised that he would bury the helmet as well, which he doesn't do, because he keeps the helmet for himself. There is an irony here in the fact that he is supposed to be very knightly and very onerous, but Ferrau is more of a comedic and almost pathetic character. So to remind his readers of the Orlando Innamorato, Ariosto at the end of stanza 14, he tells us about Ferrau, for stooping hastily to drink his fill in the river, he let his helmet tumble in the stream. try as he might, it still eluded him. So as soon as Rinaldo arrives, the battle begins between Ferrau and Rinaldo. And here I think I have an example of where the English translation, even if it's a really good one, might maybe lose a little bit of the strength of the Italian. I'm talking about stanza 17, especially the first 4 lines of the stanza, that in English, in the Barbara Reynolds translation, sound like this: piercing the armor and the coats of mail and sturdy bucklers which no better fare. Here Reynolds decided to change something and not translate literally, because Ariosto mentioned an anvil in his original. Ariosto says, "Ma I colpi lor non reggerian gli incudi," and incudi or incudine in Italian is an anvil. Even an anvil would not be able to bear the blows of these 2 knights that they are hitting each other with. One verse that is often highlighted of this Canto 1 is the beginning of stanza 22, where it says, "O noble chivalry of knights of yore, he were 2 rivals of opposed belief, who from the blows exchange were bruised and sore, aching from the head to foot, yet to each other no resentment bore." The celebration of the knightly and chivalry values still present in Ariosto. He always has this kind of ironic and sarcastic eye, but is always mixed with a serious admiration for these values and for other types of values. So at this point, what happens is the 2 new pals, Ferrau and Rinaldo, are riding on the same horse. They get to where the road bifurcates and they decide to go in different directions. Ferrau wanders around and wonder, he ends up at the beginning, at exactly the same spot where he was in the beginning, at the river bank. And at this river bank, he decides to at least do something with himself and try to recuperate and to fish out the helmet from the river. But at this moment, he is faced by, in a very Dantean scene that reminds us of the scene of Farinata in Inferno, in the Dante Inferno, by the ghost of Angelica's brother Argalia, who appears and he has the helmet. And Ferrau at the end swears and vows to go after the helmet of Orlando, because that will make him feel proud again. In the meantime, what's happening to Rinaldo? Rinaldo is also going around and looking for Angelica, but at some point, as we can see in stanza 31, he finds his horse that's galloping around by himself, his great horse Baiardo. So at around the middle of stanza 31, he says, "Rinaldo had not traveled far when, lo, he saw his charger galloping ahead. Baiardo, my Baiardo," he starts calling him, and Rinaldo starts chasing Baiardo because Baiardo is not stopping, he just keeps going. And so we have this additional dynamic scene of Rinaldo chasing Baiardo, again interrupted in this constant interlacing of plots and subplots. Then stanza 33 begins and the scene has completely changed. We are now in a beautiful location where Angelica has come after galloping and riding along for a long time. And in this beautiful, it's a little field, she is very tired and she wants to get a little bit of rest. In this small field, Angelica finds a beautiful little corner where she can go and rest while keeping an eye on the field. And now we have yet another character. This first canto is so full of characters coming into the scene. We only see him very depressed. He stands like petrified for an hour and then he starts crying and sobbing. We know then a little later that his name is Sacripante. Sacripante was another character from the Orlando Innamorato, so one of Matteo Boiardo's characters. He was yet another lover of Angelica. He fell in love with Angelica and he had participated to some wars to defend Angelica, and in the Orlando Innamorato he was definitely one of the unlucky suitors of Angelica. So what Sacripante is crying about is that his and in a very comedic way, in fact, because he's crying, he's losing his face with the reader in front of us, and she is seeing him and hearing him, is the fact that he thinks he's heard that Angelica has lost her innocence with Orlando, while Orlando was taking her back to France. So she hears his voice, Sacripante's voice, and she starts to plot. If I play my cards right, I can use him as my almost servant to be brought back to Cathay, to my kingdom, my reign. In fact, the 4 last lines of stanza 51 say the following in Italian. Alcun inganno di tenerlo in speranza ordisce e trama, tanto che a quel bisogno se ne serva, poi torni all'uso suo dura e proterva. Now it actually gets funnier and funnier from the moment when Angelica jumps out, shows herself. What Ariosto says is il fior virginal così aveva salvo, which is specifically, he's literally translated as she still had saved her virginal flower. And here comes possibly the funniest stanza of the canto, where Ariosto is laughing at Sacripante, and he's laughing at, in a benevolent way, at all of us, anyone who's ever fallen in love, because he says at stanza 56, quel che l'uom vede, amor gli fa invisibile, e l'invisibil fa veder amore. We again have an example here of universality of some of the verses of Ariosto. Not only one color, not only one note, a harmony, a symphony of many different things. And at this point, after all those incredibly noble thoughts and things that he had said just before, Sacripante thinks inside himself, inside his soul, and he very quickly decides to snatch the opportunity and take Angelica with his force. Because if Orlando has been so stupid to miss the opportunity, as Angelica is saying, he won't be so stupid. So he prepares himself to basically assault her. But something happens, and everything changes again. And this fight between Sacripante and this mysterious white knight is described in a marvelous way. I personally enjoyed the description of this fight more than all the other fights in Canto 1, 62 and 63. Fe lo scontro tremar dal basso all'alto, l'erbose valli insino ai poggi ignudi, e ben giovò che fur buoni e perfetti gli osberghi sì, che lor salvaro i petti. Now we have to deal with Sacripante's shame, which is another cause of great comedic effect. Not only he knows that Angelica has seen the entire fight, but he also in stanza 66 he says, not only he has been defeated, but Angelica, to add to his disgrace, now lifts the heavy burden from his back, and, save for her, all power of speech he lack. It's been her to help him stand up from underneath the horse, so there's kind of a double shame already. In a sly way, Angelica tries to make things better for him and to console his hurt pride, because it's in her interest that Sacripante remains a proud knight, because she wants to use him for her goals to go back to Cathay. You've just been disheartened by a valiant and courageous woman. This is the third and final blow to Sacripante's pride. It was actually a woman. It was the famous Bradamante, who is the second of the famous progenitors, together with Ruggiero and Bradamante, who are sung by Ariosto as the ancient progenitors of the Este family. So she obviously is portrayed as extremely strong, intelligent, and of valor. You can just imagine the type of giggles and laughter that this type of stanzas produced when the epic was sung and recited aloud inside the court. Of course, that was the entire point, to make people happy, to make people laugh, but also at the same time also make them think a little bit and reflect on their world. All these intertwined lines come together at the end of the canto, because as Sacripante and Angelica are riding on one same horse, they find Baiardo In fact, Baiardo is Rinaldo's horse, and if you remember, we left Rinaldo chasing Baiardo, chasing his own horse. So everything comes together here in this final beautiful scene where Sacripante tries in some way to tame Baiardo. He almost gets kicked by Baiardo, who doesn't want to have anything to do with Sacripante. And finally we have Rinaldo appearing on the scene. And at this point, given that Angelica is there, everybody realizes that the next step is inevitable, which is a great battle between these two knights, Rinaldo and Sacripante. But Ariosto, always with his little wink and with his little sly smile, says, "You're gonna hear about this battle later on." Thank you for following along this Canto 1 of Orlando Furioso. In the next video, we're gonna read together Canto 2 and 3. I hope you enjoyed it. Please feel free to comment here, ask questions. We'll try to discuss this canto first from any point of view, language or a plot or story, or even if some of the things that I've tried to explain were not very clear. So thank you again. We'll speak soon. Bye.